this idea of these different kinds of work and how they interrelate, and how, when you kind of come back to, okay, so people are out there and they have their chiropractor and their massage therapist and their personal trainer and their physical therapist and their general practitioner and their guru and their,
18 cottage industries.
Yeah, right. And to me, they're all like part of one overall thing, obviously, and integrating them and not just conceptually understanding the common threads, but experientially integrating them in your life is huge, I think.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. Kind of how does that happen? Because I feel like what we talked about initially, like right at the start of the podcast, is just the symptoms versus causes. And that you may have a lot of people in your life treating a different symptom. So one way that they're related conceptually is that they may have a common cause, but they may have different causes, but either way, you have this cadre of people working on all of these symptoms, and how do you go about integrating all that work you're having done? Two parts to that question too is, how do you do that as a client, and how do you do it as a practitioner?
Yeah, because depending on your religion, depending on your worldview, the basic tenets, if you will, that I operate from are universal. In order to do the work that I do, meaning for me and the client to do the work together, I don't need them even to be a believer, in whatever it would be that they'd be believing in. I don't need them to be of a certain religious faith. I don't need them to be of a certain sexual orientation. I don't need them to have certain, political views. The work is always, let's look at what's there. Let's just look at what's there, because that's really what it comes back to is that the kind of pathology or distortion or pattern, ego pattern, that's always just a result of not being conscious. And so let's try to become conscious of it. And then whatever the change is in their body, in their mind, whatever the change is, their system decides the change. I'm not suggesting a change in this way or that. I'm just suggesting and facilitating that they get more consciously in touch with what is already there.
I think that's an important point that you've said in different ways before. I think the way you just said it is good. There isn't a prescribed path to recovery. I did want to say though, that it doesn't matter what the person's background is, but there is like a selection bias in the fact that they're there to begin with. But I do think that point, as far as seeing how to integrate these things, is you have to get out of your lane to an extent, because I think the more specific practices have a lot of cause and effect. And I think what you're saying is that there is a cause and the effect is evident, but the path to recovery from it isn't constant or isn't universal from person to person. The methodology is, like you're saying, the approach is, but what that looks like for each person isn't necessarily the same. Or you can't dictate it. Again, like there's aspects of it that are, like we talked about, as far as trauma and healing trauma, like that is the same process. But what that looks like for the person, like what healing looks like, it's not like a bone being set.
I mean, I've used the bone setting analogy of healing a split, but the split coming together happens as a result of bringing consciousness, as opposed to me saying, hey, try to bring that split together. So it's always just, just looking. And again, one of the reasons I call it the dimension approach is because making that distinction between, not just between content and process, because that's a distinction that's an important one that gets made, but a distinction between operating within a dimension versus operating with regard to the organization of dimensions. Again, it's like, to use the computer analogy, if you have a certain file open and you have it maximized on your screen, and then you're working with the content of that file, that's different than if you step back and start paying attention to, okay, what file is this? What folder is it in? Is that the one I want open right now? Should I have that maximized on my screen, or should I have it as one of several windows I should have open on my screen right now? Right, that's a whole different level of operation. And the work I do is much more about that. It's about managing files. It's about becoming more conscious of what's going on. And so sometimes it's okay, the problem, the root of the problem is in a certain dimension. I'm helping the person find the dimension. And if the dimension is found, then we can work with the problem, and then the work can become more specific. But even when we're working within a dimension, I'm still helping the person consciously see what's going on. I'm not telling them the shift to make. I'm just saying, and this is like the big amazing thing, is that our ego mind doesn't need to make the shift, because our ego mind is not, the problem is that the ego mind's in the driver's seat. So whatever your problem is, whatever the symptom, whatever the root cause, what you'll eventually come to is, oh, I see the problem. The problem is that my ego's in charge here and is blocking out my soul. My ego's in charge. I'm blocking out my consciousness. I'm blocking out essence in favor of an ego orientation. That's the problem. And when you shift that and orient from consciousness, the system rights itself. And it often writes itself in a way that the ego either wasn't even aware was an option, and or often in a way that the ego thought was for sure the exact thing that shouldn't be allowed to happen. For example, often consciousness will say, so to speak, just let go of it, or just accept the loss, or let it die. And the ego's like, what? That's not, like, no, I don't think that's a good option.
I can't remember whose story it is, but somebody talks about death as feeling like taking off a very tight shoe.
Yeah,
Yeah, and I think it applies to the death you're talking about as well. This death to the sense of control over something that you're just fighting against how it should be.
Right. But the ego just can't see it, so it feels like dying as the shoe's coming off.
Right.
It feels like the taking that shoe off to the ego mind. The ego mind experiences that as taking your foot off, like you're going to lose something essential. And the big spiritual truth is that it's impossible to lose something that is essential. You can lose touch with it in your mind, but in actuality, it can't be lost. And so then the idea is, ultimately, we could let go and quit running around trying to save and protect our essence, our soul, our consciousness, our real self, because it's indestructible. And the idea of awakening is that you start to become more directly in touch with that. And so you become more fearless.
So how do you, as a practitioner, go about incorporating some of those ideas into a more focused modality? So if you are going to bring the dimension approach to physical therapy? What does that look like?
It varies in a big way, client to client. And then, of course, it varies even with the same client, session to session or moment to moment. But if I tried to answer that generally, whatever level I see the client orienting from in relation to the overall pattern, right? So let's say that I can see the whole pattern from the physical all the way to the conscious, right? Again, I'm saying there's this causation hierarchy, but cause can go up and down, although generally speaking, it's a top-down model. Consciousness at the top, then imaginal, then subtle, then mental, then emotional, then physical. But again, the order of that it's a little more complex than that. But if we say there's that order of causation, and one little thing about that is by way of analogy, it's like if you take temperature, the temperature in the room you're in right now, meaning the vibratory frequency of the air molecules, would be, let's say, analogous to the subtle level. And then the physical objects in the room you're in, if those were gross level objects, the temperature or the vibratory frequency of the air molecules is determining the temperature of the gross level physical objects. Now, yes, at the same time, the temperature of the gross level physical objects is affecting the air temperature, right? It's an interrelational thing. But typically the air molecules are a win. You know what I mean? The air molecules are having more of an effect on the objects than the objects are on the air. So when you turn your furnace on and it heats up the air in the room, it also heats up, the temperature of the table and the temperature of all the various objects. But if you take an object and heat it up, then it's going to have a certain effect on the temperature in the air. And then, of course, you can get more and more detailed. It's like, well, if you take a radiator heater that you plug in, and then it's going to radiate heat, and so it has a bigger effect because of the heat that it radiates than an object that gets real hot, but it's not radiating heat. And so, again, you could go down a rabbit hole with creating analogies there, but again, the in general, it's this top-down thing. If you take that same radiator and you plug it in outdoors, it's like, well, now your little plug-in radiator is going to have a hell of a time heating, the Earth's atmosphere. It had a much better chance when you closed a room off and then plugged it in that room with the intent of having it heat the air in that room. So again, this vibratory frequency thing, temperature is vibratory frequency, right? And so consciousness has a higher vibratory frequency than the imaginal, or a more powerful one, if you want to use that word, a more causative. And I'm saying consciousness is more causative than imaginal. Imaginal is more causative than subtle. Subtle is more causative than mental. And again, the mental subtle hierarchy, it as we kind of talked about before, it's, you can get into levels of mind and blah, blah, blah. And so again, this model is as always with this stuff, it's a huge simplification. And so it's hard to have the categories be super distinct, but am I making the overall point?
Relating frequency to causative level, I thought was good.
So if you go back to your question about how to well, you state it the way you stated it.
So I just said that, as a practitioner, how do you incorporate the dimension approach into a particular modality?
So I'm looking at, in any given client, in any given session, at any given moment, I'm trying to look at all these levels at once and get a sense of, okay, what's the overall pattern here? What's going on? Meaning what's going on at each level. And I'm also looking at which level is the client looking at this pattern from? And what I can tell you for sure is always the case is they aren't looking at it from the conscious level, or it wouldn't be a pattern. So I can check that one off the list. Are they ego aware of it, which is different than being consciously aware of it? Meaning, are they ego aware of the imaginal? Are they ego aware of the subtle? Are they ego aware of the emotional? Which means, like, let's say there's intense rage that's going on the emotional level with regard to this pattern. Are they ego aware of the rage, or is that something that they don't even know is there? Are they ego aware of the tightness in their calves? Or are they just ego aware of the pain in their low back and they don't know that their calves are so tight? Again, I'm not just looking at, their calves are tight, and because of the tensegrity issue in the body, the tight calves are compromising their low back, and so their low back hurts. That's having an emotional effect, and that's having a mental effect, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And actually, there's this thing going on in the imaginal realm, which is really the deeper cause of the calves being tight, because the imaginal level thing is making them pinch off their first chakra. The pinching off their first chakra is causing their fascial tissue in their calves to get real inelastic, et cetera. So I'm seeing this overall pattern. But then in addition to that, and this is, again, where I'm saying the dimension approach does this different thing than I think what is kind of typical, which is I'm looking at what is the client's orientation, anchoring, and identification with regard to this pattern. And the fix, the methodology, the dimension approach methodology, is to work with the client's orientation, anchoring, and identification. It's not to just go after the pattern itself. The pattern is simply symptomatic on all these different levels. The pattern, that's this multi-level pattern, because every pattern is, the multi-level pattern is symptomatic of where's the client orienting, where are they anchoring, where are they identifying. And I'm working with that. And so that's, again, why I'm saying I'm not really, they don't have to have an ideology or a spiritual belief or a political view or something. I'm just helping them shift their attention. Because again, if attention is the primary or base activity, it's like, where are they attending from? What are they attending to? What are they attending as? And I'm working with that. And the pattern is locked into place. This restrictive pattern, this pattern that is causing problems, this pattern that's a distortion of what would be ideal, is locked into place because the person is orienting from somewhere other than consciousness. That's always the root cause. At any given time, it's like, well, if nothing else, the most potent thing to do is to help them consciously get in touch with it, right? But sometimes it takes more of a step-by-step process to get them there, which is why it involves, well, where are they anchoring? What are they currently identifying as? How do I get them to, or how do we, meaning the client and I, how do we work together to help them start to release or disidentify with the thing they're identifying with? And it's like, oh man, here we go, because that's not easy.
Well, I was just thinking that from the practitioner's standpoint, if you can't work with an awareness of where someone is attending from, or what they're anchoring to, or what they're identifying as, all of that stuff would come across as personality and may just be seen as a hurdle to get through work, to get over, to work with a person. Because in a way it's a construction, it's a compensation, it is a personality, but it's not, you have to see something in the client beyond that to begin to do any work around bringing conscious awareness to what's going on.
Yeah, and that's what ultimately is so challenging, because if you're really going to go at the root of it, that you're challenging the person's experience of selfhood.
And you have to have had some experience challenging your own sense of selfhood.
Yeah, if you're gonna go very deep into it, that's typically the case. Like you said, the people that come to me and that keep coming have to be in relation to the pattern we're going to work on. They have to be at some level of willingness. I mean, I try to adjust.
Right. But I'm saying that like your ability to adjust is based on self-work that you've done. So if a practitioner is going to incorporate the dimension approach, some aspect of that is seeing enough about themselves to get past another person's personality when working with them. So I feel like we've all been to like a doctor that is just like agitated and doesn't want to deal with you because they've like have some judgment of you. Like there's just bad practitioners everywhere in all sorts of different fields.
Yeah.
But
as far as practicing the dimension approach, which I'm going to say it again, everyone's practicing the dimension approach sometimes, and sometimes you're not. But yeah, at any moment, if we're going to practice the dimension approach, meaning if we're going to bring consciousness to something and try to hold it and mirror it, et cetera, then yeah, you have to navigate personality in yourself and in whether you're working on yourself, so to speak, or whoever it is you're working with. And there's that thing where part of the cruel joke that God has played on us all is that those personalities, like you're talking about, that we most clash with, tend to be, you hear that thing, that those are the best mirrors, right? Because it's like, okay, why are we so annoyed by them, or why are they so annoyed by us? It's like, well, because there's some pattern. The clash is a pattern clash. Because it's always a pattern clash. Consciousness doesn't clash with consciousness.
And it's like as soon as you see one, then like an even better mirror shows up.
Right.
In your life.
Yeah, and even better meaning an even worse.
Oh, like painfully worse.
It's like a haunted house with these distorted mirrors, and like each mirror that you come to is just a worse and worse thing you see in there. And of course, the big spiritual idea is the deeper you go into the ego, the worse and worse the reflection is initially. And it seems terrible. It makes you want to turn around and run back the other way and find a mirror that's not so awful. But if you can remember that you're really just in the ego realm, which is a hall of distorted mirrors, and that the truth is, right? The truth is consciousness. Consciousness is not the ego. And so you're seeing the truth of the ugliness of the ego, but that's not self. And so it's this, this contradiction where it's like once you finally recognize that, you can start to encounter something in your ego self that seems so contrary to what your sense of an ego ideal would be. And instead of, oh my God, I got to run from that, or I got to deny it, or I got to feel so ashamed. Instead, it's like in the midst of the discomfort of it, or even the pain of it, there's this excitement that, oh wow, I'm going even deeper. And if I can get some change in this place, it'll really make a profound impact.
Is that related to, I feel like some people describe that as singing through the ego, or using the ego as a tool in that search, finding the part of that personality that can see that. Is that fair?
Yes. Yeah, it's an important point. It's all happening at once, right? So on a purely conscious level, it's that thing that sort of those cliche things where it's like on the purely conscious level, there's no trying and there's no excitement about progress because there's no progress that needs to be made, right? But simultaneously, not instead of, but simultaneously, there's various levels of the ego, and there's levels of your ego that are trapped in unconsciousness, and there's levels of your ego that are more ego aware, and et cetera, et cetera. And so obviously in the work I do, I'm not just saying, no matter what your symptom is, well, let's just sit in consciousness. Let's sit in consciousness. Let's just, and then that's not who you really are. Who you really are is consciousness. So let's just do that. That I'm just not, that's not, I think that's true. And that's a certain approach. And I certainly spend time in that kind of practice. But in addition to that, right? And that's one of the big changes is it's like, look, in addition to that, without compromising the idea of consciousness, the idea of non-duality, at the same time, you can work on these different levels and you can employ different aspects of your ego in the endeavor.
Because I think that's the best distinction so far in the role of the ego, the potential of the ego, and the reality that is never fully transcended. Like maybe in some theoretical state in a lab, or like in that there's this idea that you can move beyond it, and that would very much be the exception rather than the rule. But I like the way you frame it, that it can be an active, vital participant in the process, because there's healthy and unhealthy egos, right? There's healthy and unhealthy senses of self. So there's work that has to be done to get to a point that some part of your self can work towards discovering consciousness, or work towards, freeing trapped parts of yourself, right? Or of your psyche.
Right.
So it's not that that's just like granted, or that's not just guaranteed at the outset, but there's a lot of strength and power and usefulness in it.
Generally speaking, the New Age spirituality critique, and even if you take the word spirituality out of it, because it seems like it used to be New Age spirituality, and as religion is less and less popular, and the idea of spirit is less and less popular, and instead it's the universe, or it's whatever the secular term is supposed to be. The critique of that is, and this also goes into the overall existential critique, is this overemphasis on, well, that's just ego. That's just ego. So whatever someone's thinking or feeling or doing, like we critique it that, well, that's just ego. That's just your ego. But that doesn't mean it's bad or wrong or invalid. And are you saying false ego self? Are you saying emotion versus thought? Are you know what I mean? It's way more complex. It's kind of like I was saying with subtle energy, people are, talk about clearing their chakras. And it's like, that doesn't even make any sense. I'm going to clear my chakras, balance my chakras. I'm going to critiquing someone saying, that's just your ego.
It's active repression.
Right.
It's not even unconscious repression. It's just active repression, social repression.
Yeah. Yeah.
And really they're just saying, I don't want to look at that part of myself. Don't say that.
Yeah. And we're doing that as a society in more and more secular ways. It's like we've been doing it spiritually, and it's like more and more we're trying to do it socially. We're just, well, that's just patriarchy. That's just racist. That's just, sexist. And as if we're gonna, by labeling it and calling it out and calling it bad, we're coming from and are going to be able to stay at and operate beyond that in some kind of awakened, or woke place that's superior to all that. And it's not only bullshit, it's super dangerous.
Sky and I have been talking about this for like the last couple days in relation to just something going on in the Twitter sphere right now. But just what you're talking about, that it's a like in integral theory, they call it like mean green. So this idea that there's some somewhat world-centric worldview at play, but really it's just a new attempt to define self versus other that doesn't really consider other as self. So like that's the fundamental like versus like a distinction between it and any kind of cosmocentric worldview, that you are still defining a tribe and excluding someone based on something they say that you decide is morally wrong.
Totally. I like that, the way that was put, which is ultimately a pre-trans fallacy between, if you're using colors, you think you're being green, but you're really being blue when you do that.
Right. And it's tough because I think it's like an animating force that's useful in changing the cultural discussion, but it's at the expense of someone else.
Yeah, because it's demonizing, right? It's condemning.
Right.
And that idea that as far as inclusiveness, as far as, like you said, trying to have something not be self is the action of trying to exclude from consciousness. Because consciousness includes as self. It includes, not, the words are tricky. It includes it as real, as existent, as valid, which doesn't mean it likes it. It doesn't mean it's not making a value statement, but it includes it versus an attempt to eliminate it from reality. And that weird thing we do where anything we try to exclude in an ultimate way, in an absolute way, the truth is you cannot exclude it. You cannot truly get rid of it. So that's like the first part, right? Whatever it is that you think is evil, whatever you think is bad or wrong or whatever, it's like, well, the attempt to have it not be so, to have it not exist, to banish it from reality is the ultimate sin, right? It's the ultimate mistake. It's the ego trying to play God. Your ego doesn't get to banish anything from reality. It's not up to you, meaning it's not up to your ego. That's the idea. But we all make the mistake of doing that. And then we suffer because of that. Because when we decide, all right, you know what, I'm good with all of, and again, if I just use kind of the let's say Christian language or Judeo-Christian language, I'm cool with most of your creation, God, except this group of stuff over here. And so I'm going to lock that stuff out of my consciousness. I'm going to exclude that stuff. But I'm good with all the rest of it. And so I'm going to live in this part and not in that part. And when we do that, the way we do that is we close off our mind, right? We split our consciousness from X, Y, and Z. And rather than it truly excluding X, Y, and Z from reality, we simply blind ourselves to X, Y, and Z as far as being able to consciously see X, Y, and Z. We don't get rid of X, Y, and Z. We blind ourselves in the same way that if you close your eyes, it didn't go dark outside. It just went dark inside, meaning inside your mind. That move that we do without knowing it, because again, it's not a conscious move. Again, the language gets tricky. Our consciousness wouldn't decide to banish something. but our ego decides to, right? And so we close off, and now we've blinded ourselves to it. And now we cannot see it clearly. X, Y, and Z now, it's not like it's not around, it's still around, and despite our best efforts to banish it or to eliminate it or condemn it or eradicate it, there it is. Now we can no longer see it consciously, we're only ego aware of it. And now we're disempowered in relation to it. We've disabled ourselves in relation to X, Y, and Z now. So now we hate it even more. We fear it even more. And it's like, well, geez, what's the solution? The solution is to bring consciousness back to it. And it's like, wait, I don't want to bring consciousness to what I deemed evil. Won't bringing consciousness to the evil increase and empower the evil? It's like, no, it won't. And that's the huge, maybe the biggest hurdle, is that when you get to a point where you look face to face at what you think, whether it's outside yourself, so to speak, meaning some thing in society or some person or some ideology or something, or whether it's something in yourself, either way, when you come face to face with that, and it's like, oh my God, that's evil. That's terrible. That's disgusting. It's awful. I fucking hate it. And it seems absolutely certain that what you need to do is get away from it, get it stopped, kill it, get rid of it. And it's like, what you really need to do is bring consciousness to it. But consciousness is this loving, inclusive, accepting embrace. Whatever you're being conscious of, you're including it in a loving, accepting, beautiful way. And the ego mind just does not get that. It doesn't make any sense. And the truth is, it doesn't. It does not make sense. It's not rational. And the effect that bringing the consciousness has is not the effect that the ego is certain it's going to have. So it's spiritual. It's magical. It's a miracle. Bringing consciousness to the darkness has an effect that, from the ego's perspective, is miraculous. In episode 1, you said it was hard to talk about this stuff without starting to sound evangelical.
Right.
I'm watching myself sounding evangelical here.
Right. Well, it's tough too, because it's a conscious holding of something, which doesn't mean you accept how it's presented in the world. It doesn't mean you accept physically on the ground what's happening. It doesn't mean you're condoning something. It just means that in your response to it, you're not trying to exclude everything about it. That you can seek change, and you can seek reform, and you can acknowledge societal structures that aren't to anyone's benefit in the long term. And you can do that without cutting off a foot.
Right.
And it's not even about compromise. Like, some people are fully wrong about things. It's not that you have to meet people halfway. I don't think that's what consciousness means. It just means that there is an understanding that everything involved is part of the whole. So it's just, I think it really comes down to defining these boundaries between self and other and expanding what that is. There are social theorists that think that in order to have a society, there has to be an other. And the other can't be a person. I mean, the other can't even be the idea. The other has to be the manifestation of that idea. There's like this balance between how we feel about people and how we feel about the things they do. And if we want to change how things are done, it can't be at the expense of the people doing them.
I like that. How come it doesn't sound evangelical when you're talking about it?
You just caught me on a good day. I get real soapboxy and unapproachable. A lot of people rolling their eyes and walking away. If you want to learn more about the Dimension Approach, please visit dimensionapproach.com.